It was a typical evening in the neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. I was sitting in my living room, watching TV, when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before getting up to answer it. When I opened the door, I was greeted by my neighbor from across the street. He had a strange look in his eyes, like he was staring right through me. Without saying a word, he handed me a small package and walked away quickly, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later that night, things took a turn for the worse. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard strange noises coming from outside my window. It sounded like someone was whispering my name, but when I looked out, there was no one there. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I heard it, footsteps outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth. I lay there frozen in fear, listening as the footsteps grew louder and closer. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was my neighbor, his eyes wild with madness as he stared at me. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, running for the door. But before I could reach it, he lunged at me, his hands grasping for my throat. I fought back with all my strength, but he was too strong. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I heard sirens in the distance. The police burst into the room, pulling my neighbor off of me and dragging him away in handcuffs. As they led him away, he looked back at me with a sinister grin, whispering words that chilled me to the bone. "I'll be back," he said, his voice filled with malice. I never saw my neighbor again after that night, but the memory of his terrifying visit still haunts me to this day. And every time I hear a knock at the door, I can't help but wonder if he's come back to finish what he started. In the days following that harrowing encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a thick fog. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sent shivers down my spine, reminding me of the terror I had experienced. I tried to go about my daily routine as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore the lingering fear that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, plagued by nightmares of my neighbor's sinister grin and the sound of his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Despite my best efforts to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that my neighbor's threat was very real. I began to notice strange occurrences around the neighborhood. Missing pets, vandalized property, and whispered rumors of strange rituals performed under the cover of night. The sense of unease that permeated the neighborhood only grew stronger as the days passed, and I found myself becoming increasingly paranoid. I started avoiding my neighbors, jumping at the slightest sound, and double-checking every lock and bolt before bed. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I was safe, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if a dark shadow loomed over me, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then one night it happened. I was awoken by the sound of glass shattering downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps creeping up the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically searched for something, anything, to defend myself with. But before I could react, the bedroom door burst open and my neighbor stood before me, his eyes burning with a feral intensity. He lunged at me with a wild scream, his hands clawing at my throat as if possessed by some unseen force. I fought back with everything I had, desperation lending me strength as I grappled with him in the darkness. But he was relentless, his grip like a vice around my neck as he pinned me to the ground. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a blinding light filled the room as police officers burst through the door, guns drawn and voices shouting commands. They pulled my neighbor off of me and dragged him away, his screams echoing in the night as he was taken into custody once again. As I lay there gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the shock of what had just transpired, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had fallen victim to my neighbor's twisted machinations. And as the truth slowly began to unravel, I realized that the horror was far from over. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of scratching coming from the wall beside me. At first I brushed it off as just some odd noise from the neighbors, but it didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to get louder and more persistent with each passing minute. I lay there, frozen with fear, as the scratching continued. Then, as if that wasn't unsettling enough, I started to hear whispers. They were faint at first, but they grew louder and clearer, echoing through the darkness of my room. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was chilling. It was like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of that wall was trying to communicate with me, taunting me with their words. I knew I had to do something. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed the landlord's number. But when I explained the situation, they just brushed it off, saying it was probably just mice or something. But I knew it wasn't just mice. There was something sinister about those whispers, something that sent shivers down my spine. I debated calling the police, but I was hesitant to involve them without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the wall where the sounds were coming from. I pressed my ear against the cold surface, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. And then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. The whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do next. But just as I was about to retreat back to the safety of my bed, I heard it, a faint tapping coming from the other side of the wall. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Whatever was on the other side of that wall wasn't just some harmless noise. It was something far more sinister, something that made my blood run cold. I fled back to my bed, pulling the covers tight around me as I tried to block out the sounds. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for its chance to strike. And as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the night dragged on, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to echo with the presence of whatever was lurking on the other side of that wall. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for the strange sounds I had heard. Maybe it was just the pipes rattling, or the wind whistling through the cracks in the old building. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something malevolent in those whispers, something that defied all rational explanation. As the hours passed, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to find even a moment's peace. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the scratching, the whispers, the tapping, haunting me like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. I considered calling the police again, but I knew they wouldn't take me seriously without any concrete evidence of wrongdoing. And besides, what could they do that I hadn't already tried? I was alone in this, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. With a sense of resignation, I resigned myself to the fact that I would have to face whatever was on the other side of that wall alone. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest as the minutes stretched into hours. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noises stopped. The scratching, the whispers, the tapping, all of it fell silent, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but the pounding of my own heart for company. I lay there, listening intently for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no indication that whatever had been tormenting me was still there. It was as if it had never been there at all. I wanted to believe that it was over, that I could finally get some sleep, and put this whole ordeal behind me. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that whatever had been on the other side of that wall was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. With a sense of dread creeping over me, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but it was a fitful slumber plagued by nightmares of scratching claws and whispered threats. The next morning, I awoke to find the sun streaming through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But then I saw the scratches on the wall, the faint marks left behind by whatever had been clawing at the plaster in the darkness. I knew then that it hadn't been a dream. It had been all too real. And as I stared at those scratches, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked just beyond the walls of my apartment, waiting to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. It was a hot summer night, the kind where the air feels thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. I had just moved into a new apartment complex, excited to start fresh in a new neighborhood. But little did I know, I was about to encounter something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I settled into my new place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a strange vibe in the air, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, attributing it to the stress of moving. But as the days passed, the feeling only intensified. I started noticing strange noises coming from the apartment next door, muffled cries, thuds against the wall, and whispered conversations that seemed to never end. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was none of my business. But as the noises continued night after night, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. Something wasn't right. One night, unable to sleep due to the constant racket next door, I decided to investigate. I crept out into the hallway, heart pounding in my chest, and pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out what was being said. What I heard sent shivers down my spine. It was the voice of my neighbor, but it wasn't speaking to anyone else. It was talking to itself in a low, guttural whisper that made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was filled with malice, with hatred, with something dark and sinister that chilled me to the bone. Terrified, I stumbled back to my apartment and locked the door, praying that whatever was next door would leave me alone. But the noises only grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking my feeble attempts to escape. That night I barely slept, the sound of my neighbor's voice echoing in my mind like a twisted lullaby. And when morning finally came, I knew I had to get out of there before whatever was next door decided to pay me a visit. I packed my bags in a frenzy, barely pausing to grab my essentials before fleeing the apartment, never looking back. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly evil, something that lurked just beyond the thin walls of my former home. To this day, I still don't know what was living next door, what twisted horrors it was capable of, but one thing's for certain. I'll never forget the terror of those nights, the feeling of being hunted by something that should never have existed in the first place. And as I look back on that experience, I can't help but wonder, was it truly over? Or is something still out there, waiting for its next victim to cross its path? As I drove away from that nightmare of an apartment complex, my heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with questions. What had I just experienced? Was it all in my head? Or was there truly something sinister lurking next door? I found myself unable to shake the feeling of unease, even as I put miles between myself and that accursed building. Every shadow seemed to conceal a hidden threat, every sound whispered of impending danger. But despite my fear, I knew I couldn't run forever. I needed answers, so with a mixture of trepidation and determination, I resolved to delve deeper into the mystery of my former neighbor and the horrors they harbored. I began by scouring the internet for any information I could find about the apartment complex and its residents. But to my frustration, there was little to be gleaned. The building had a history of frequent turnover, with tenants coming and going like ghosts in the night. Still, I refused to be deterred. I reached out to the few neighbors I had managed to meet during my brief stay, hoping they might shed some light on the situation. But to my dismay, they either brushed off my concerns or claimed ignorance, insisting that nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened in the building. Frustrated and feeling increasingly isolated, I turned to more unconventional methods in my search for answers. I consulted psychics, mediums, and even self-proclaimed experts in the paranormal, desperate for any insight into the true nature of my neighbor's malevolent presence. But despite their assurances and elaborate rituals, I found no solace, no closure. If anything, their cryptic warnings and dire predictions only served to deepen my sense of dread. And then, just when I thought I had hit a dead end, a breakthrough came in the form of an old newspaper article I stumbled upon during one of my late-night internet binges. It was buried deep in the archives, almost forgotten, but its contents sent a chill down my spine. The article recounted a series of unsolved disappearances that had plagued the neighborhood years earlier, each victim vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only whispered rumors and shattered lives. As I read on, my blood ran cold. The disappearances had all occurred within the vicinity of my former apartment complex, and one name in particular jumped out at me. The name of my former neighbor. According to the article, they had been a suspect in the investigation, but lack of evidence had led to their eventual release. Still, the whispers persisted, fueled by the eerie aura that seemed to surround them wherever they went. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The strange noises, the unsettling atmosphere, the feeling of being watched, it all made sense now. My neighbor wasn't just some eccentric recluse. They were something far more sinister, something beyond the realm of human understanding. With a newfound sense of urgency, I redoubled my efforts to uncover the truth, determined to confront the darkness that had haunted me for so long. But as I delved deeper into the mystery, I soon realized that some secrets are better left buried, some truths better left undiscovered. In my quest for answers, I unwittingly awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that had been slumbering beneath the surface, biding its time until the stars aligned and the moment was right. And now, as I sit here in the dead of night, haunted by the specter of my own curiosity, I can feel its presence growing stronger, its tendrils of darkness reaching out to claim me as its own. I know now that I am not alone, that I am being watched, hunted by something far more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. And as the shadows close in around me, I can only pray that someone, somewhere, will heed my warning and steer clear of the horrors that lurk within the walls of that accursed apartment complex. The other night, I was sitting alone in my dimly lit living room, watching some TV, when I heard a strange noise coming from the house next door. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was just the wind or something. But then the noise got louder, and it sounded like someone was moving around inside the house. I got up from the couch and went to the window to see if I could see anything. That's when I saw him, a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness of my neighbor's yard. He was tall and thin, with a hunched posture that made him look even more menacing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched him skulk around, peering into windows and trying to open doors. It was clear that he didn't belong there and that he had sinister intentions. I quickly called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but couldn't find any trace of him. For the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump in fear. Then, one night as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft tapping at my bedroom window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I slowly turned to face the window. And there he was again, the same shadowy figure from before, staring back at me with cold, lifeless eyes. I screamed and ran to the phone, dialing 911 as fast as my shaking hands would allow. But when the police arrived, once again, there was no sign of the man. They searched the area thoroughly, but he had vanished into thin air. I couldn't sleep that night or any night after that. The fear that gripped me was like nothing I had ever experienced before. Every noise, every shadow, seemed to be a reminder of the terror that lurked just outside my door. I never did find out who that man was or what he wanted. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the horror of those nights when the darkness seemed to come alive with the presence of my creepy neighbor. As the days passed, I became increasingly paranoid. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the sinister figure who had haunted my nights was still lurking nearby, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I started to avoid going out after dark, afraid of what I might encounter in the shadows. Every time I heard a noise outside, my heart would race, and I would peer out the window, half expecting to see the man staring back at me once again. But despite my fear, life had to go on. I had to work, to run errands, to live my life as best I could despite the constant dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I noticed something strange. The front door of my neighbor's house was wide open, swinging lazily on its hinges in the gentle breeze. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the urge to investigate and the fear of what I might find inside. In the end, curiosity won out over fear, and I cautiously approached the open door. As I stepped inside, the air seemed to grow colder, and a sense of foreboding washed over me like a tidal wave. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of floorboards beneath my feet as I made my way through the dimly lit hallway. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee from whatever darkness lurked within those walls, but I pressed, driven by a morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. As I reached the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure huddled in the corner, its back turned to me. For a moment I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe as I stared in horror at the sight before me. Then, slowly, hesitantly, I approached the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew closer, I could see that it was a man, his clothes tattered and torn, his face obscured by shadows. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But the man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just sat there, rocking back and forth, muttering something unintelligible under his breath. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped my shoulder, and I let out a scream of terror as I spun around to face my attacker. But it was only my neighbor, his eyes wide with fear, his face pale as death. "You have to get out of here," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "He's coming for you." Before I could respond, there was a sudden crash from somewhere in the house, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway. My neighbor's eyes widened in terror, and without another word he turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do next. But then, as the footsteps grew closer, I knew that I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. With a final glance over my shoulder, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my own house, the door securely locked behind me. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of terror that had settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Every noise, every shadow seemed to be a reminder of the horror I had witnessed in my neighbor's house, a warning that the darkness was still out there, still waiting for its next victim. I never saw my neighbor again after that night, and I never found out what had become of him. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the terror of that night, when the darkness seemed to come alive with the presence of something truly evil, and I'll never be able to shake the feeling that it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again.